It knows when you're awake. That's the line from the Christmas song, right? The one about Santa Claus. It's supposed to be a comforting, magical thought for a child. A benevolent, omniscient being watching over you, waiting to reward you for being good. But what if the omniscience isn't benevolent? What if the watching isn't for the sake of reward, but for something else? What if the thing that knows you're awake isn't jolly, or kind, or even human? And what if the only thing it does with that knowledge is wait? I know the answer to those questions, and I'll tell you this much. You never, ever want to find out for yourself. The house was a gift, or an inheritance, which I suppose is a gift of a more somber kind. It came from my great-aunt Alara, a woman I'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings, a quiet, bird-like woman with eyes that seemed to hold a permanent, distant sadness. She'd never married, never had children, and lived her entire 87 years in that same two-story colonial on the far, wooded edge of Northam, Massachusetts. When she passed, the will was a surprise. The house, the property, all of it, went to me. My mother said Alara had always liked my quiet nature. I was 32 at the time, working as an architectural drafter for a firm in Boston. It was a good job, but demanding. I spent my days in front of a massive monitor, hunched over, drawing lines with digital precision, turning the grand, abstract visions of architects into concrete, buildable plans. It required intense focus, an obsession with detail. By the end of the day, my eyes would be burning and my brain felt like a wrung-out sponge. I was renting a cramped, overpriced apartment in Somerville, and the idea of owning a house, a real house with a yard and a history, felt like a dream. So I moved. The commute was longer, an hour and a half each way if traffic was merciful, but the trade-off seemed worth it. The house stood on a 3-acre lot, the last one on a dead-end street called Hemlock Lane. Beyond my backyard was nothing but a dense, quiet forest of pine and oak that stretched for miles. It was peaceful, the kind of deep, profound quiet I'd never experienced in the city. The house itself was substantial. Built in the 1920s, it had what realtors call good bones. Solid oak floors, thick plaster walls, a wide, welcoming staircase that groaned with a sense of history. It also had the quirks of its age. The water pipes would occasionally shudder and moan like a dying beast. The windows would rattle in their frames when the wind blew just right from the north, and the whole structure would settle at night with a chorus of creaks and groans. In the first few weeks, I cataloged these sounds, got used to them. They were the house's personality, its voice. I learned to distinguish the groan of the third step on the staircase from the pop of the radiator in the hallway. It was my house, and I was learning its language. My routine was rigid, dictated by my commute and my demanding job. My alarm would go off at 5:30 a.m., a jarring digital shriek in the profound country silence. I'd shower, dress, make coffee in the old, echoing kitchen and be out the door by 6:15. I'd get home around 7:00 p.m. exhausted. I'd make a simple dinner, maybe watch some mindless TV or read a book. The house was big, far bigger than I needed. I lived mostly on the first floor, the kitchen, the living room, a small study where I sometimes worked from home. The second floor had 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. I used the master bedroom at the front of the house. The other 2, a smaller guest room and what must have been Alara's sewing room, remained empty, their doors kept shut. I remember the first time I felt it, the first wrong note in the house's familiar symphony. It was about a month after I'd moved in, a Tuesday in late October. The leaves had all turned, and the air had that crisp, cold edge that promised an early winter. I was in the living room, sitting on the old floral sofa I'd inherited with the house, reading. The only light came from a single floor lamp beside me, casting a warm, yellow pool in the vast darkness of the room. The only sound was the rustle of the page as I turned it. That's when I heard it, a soft thump from upstairs. It wasn't one of the usual house sounds. It wasn't a creak or a groan. It was a dull, heavy sound, like a thick book being dropped flat onto a wooden floor. It came from the direction of the back of the house, from one of the empty bedrooms. I froze, the words on the page blurring. I held my breath, straining my ears, listening to the sudden, suffocating silence that followed. Nothing, just the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I tried to rationalize it. A branch falling on the roof. No, the sound was too internal, too muffled. Something falling off a shelf. But the rooms were empty. I'd cleaned them out myself. There was not. Hing on the shelves, nothing to fall. Slowly, I put my book down. I stood up, my socked feet silent on the worn oriental rug. I walked to the bottom of the staircase and looked up into the darkness of the second-floor landing. The silence was absolute. It felt watchful. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and foolish in the stillness. No response, of course not. I stood there for a full minute, my body tense, before the logic part of my brain finally wrestled control back from the primitive, frightened part. It's an old house, I told myself. It makes weird noises. You're tired. You're stressed from work. It was nothing. I forced myself to walk back to the sofa, but the spell was broken. I couldn't focus on my book. Every nerve ending felt raw, attuned to the silence of the floors above me. I gave up after another 10 minutes, turned off the light, and went upstairs to bed, making sure to check the locks on the front and back doors twice. I fell asleep that night feeling like a guest in my own home. A week later, it happened again. This time, it was different. I was in my study finishing up some drafting work I'd brought home. It was late, close to midnight. I was deep in concentration, the only sound the soft click-clack of my mouse and the low whir of my computer's fan. Then I heard a sound from the living room just beyond the study door. It was a single, distinct creak. The sound of one footstep on one specific floorboard just outside the room. I knew that creak. It was a loud one, right in the main path from the kitchen to the stairs. I stepped on it a dozen times a day. But this time it was just the one. Not a series of footsteps, not someone walking through the room. Just one single press. As if someone had put all their weight on that one spot and then stopped. My hand froze on the mouse. I didn't breathe. I listened, my ears ringing in the silence. The house was holding its breath with me. I waited for another step, for any other sound that would give it a mundane context. A settling floor joist, a shift in the foundation, but nothing came. The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate. It was the quality of the silence that was the most unnerving. It wasn't empty. It felt like the silence of a held breath, of someone listening back. I slowly, carefully pushed my chair back. The small squeak of the wheels sounded like a gunshot. I stood and walked to the study doorway. I peered out into the darkened living room. The moonlight coming through the large front window painted silver rectangles on the floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. The room was empty. Of course it was empty. I stood there for a long time, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. I eventually forced myself to walk out into the living room, my bare feet cold on the wood. I deliberately stepped on the creaky floorboard. It groaned under my weight, the sound echoing in the quiet house. My sound. It sounded nothing like the one I'd heard. The one I'd heard was slower, more careful. That was the beginning of the pattern. The incidents were always small, always deniable, and they only ever happened when I was still and quiet. If the TV was on, if I was on the phone, if I was cooking and clattering pans, there was nothing. The house was just a house. But the moment I settled into silence, the moment my own presence in the house quieted to a low hum, it would start. It was the little things that began to wear me down. A floorboard creaking in the upstairs hallway when I was sitting perfectly still in the living room below. The faint, almost inaudible scrape of what sounded like a chair leg being dragged an inch across the floor in the empty guest room. A soft click from the kitchen, like a cabinet door latching shut, long after I'd gone to bed. Each sound was isolated, a single data point in a sea of silence. My rational mind fought a desperate losing battle. It's the house settling, it's the heating, it's the wind. But the incidents had a character to them that defied simple explanation. They were too timely. They only occurred in the moments of my deepest quiet, as if the silence itself was a trigger, or more chillingly, as if my own stillness was being monitored. Sleep became my only refuge, but getting there was an ordeal. I'd lie in bed, my body rigid, my ears straining against the silence. I'd find myself listening not for a sound, but for the absence of it, a state of hypervigilance that was utterly exhausting. The house was at its most vocal when I was in this state, awake, still, and aware in the dead of night. One night I heard a new sound. It was past 2 a.m. I'd been lying awake for hours, trapped in that familiar state of tense listening. And then I heard it coming from downstairs. The soft, metallic tink, tink, tink of something tapping against glass. It was rhythmic, a slow, deliberate tapping on one of the living room windows. I lay frozen, my blood turning to ice. My mind raced. Abra. NCH? The rhythm was too perfect, too steady. An intruder. The thought sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. I imagined someone standing out there in the pitch-black yard in the dead of night, just tapping. I listened for what felt like an eternity. The tapping continued for about a minute, a patient, metronomic sound. Then it stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that rushed back in was somehow more terrifying. I didn't move a muscle until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through my curtains. I didn't sleep at all. The next day I examined the window. There were no marks on the glass, no footprints in the soft earth of the flower bed beneath it. Nothing. The exhaustion was becoming a physical weight. My performance at work was suffering. I'd stare at my screen, the complex blueprints blurring into a meaningless web of lines. My boss, a kind, 60-something man named Arthur, pulled me aside one afternoon. "Everything all right, David?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "You seem off, tired." I tried to brush it off. "Just having some trouble sleeping, that's all. New house, still getting used to it." "Old houses can be noisy," he said with a knowing nod. "My wife and I live in a Victorian. Sounds like a party of ghosts every time the wind blows." I wanted to confide in him. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just noise, that it felt intelligent, that it felt like it was for me. But how could I say that without sounding like I was losing my mind? "Something in my house knows when I'm awake." The words sounded insane even in my own head. So I just nodded and said, "Yeah, something like that." The isolation was crushing. I had friends, but they were all back in the city. I'd text them, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about what was happening. It was too strange, too personal. My reality was bifurcating. There was the day world, the world of work and traffic and grocery stores, where everything was normal and I was just a tired guy in his 30s. And then there was the night world inside the walls of that house, a silent, psychological battlefield where I was the sole combatant against something I couldn't even name. I started developing little rituals, desperate attempts to regain some control. I'd leave the TV on all night, the low murmur of an infomercial a flimsy shield against the silence. I'd play music on a small speaker in my bedroom. For a while, it seemed to work. The artificial noise drowned out the house's subtle whispers, but it was a hollow victory. I wasn't solving the problem, I was just hiding from it. And the thing in the house seemed to know that too. It was patient. One evening, I came home from work later than usual. A project had kept me at the office until almost 9 p.m. I was completely drained. I didn't even bother making dinner, just dropped my briefcase by the door and trudged upstairs. I fell into bed with my clothes still on, not even bothering to turn on the music. I was asleep before my head hit the pillow. I woke up a few hours later. I wasn't sure why. The room was pitch black and silent, not just quiet. The silence was a presence in the room, a physical weight pressing down on me. My body was on high alert, every muscle tensed. Something had woken me up. And then I heard it. It wasn't a thump or a creak or a tap. It was a whisper. It came from the hallway just outside my closed bedroom door. It was so faint I thought I was imagining it, a wisp of sound on the edge of hearing. It was impossible to make out any words. It was more like the sound of a whisper, a dry, sibilant hiss of exhaled air. It lasted for only a second, and then it was gone. I lay there, my eyes wide in the darkness, my breath caught in my throat. This was new. This was a violation of a different kind. Creaks and thumps were environmental, but a whisper was vocal, it was personal. My paranoia bloomed into full-blown terror. I began to feel watched, even during the day. I'd be sitting in my study and a sudden, prickling sensation on the back of my neck would make me spin around, my heart pounding, only to find the empty doorway. The silence was no longer an absence of sound, but an active, listening presence. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost. I was being haunted by the house itself. The question of what it was became an obsession. Was it Aunt Alara? I couldn't imagine her sad, quiet spirit tormenting me like this. Was it something else? Something that had been in the house long before her? Or the most terrifying possibility of all, was it me? Was my mind, frayed by stress and exhaustion, manufacturing this whole thing? Was I slowly, quietly, going insane in this big, empty house? The doubt was a poison, seeping into every thought, making me question my own perceptions, my own sanity. I felt like I was being methodically dismantled, piece by piece. The climax, if you can call it that, came on a Saturday night in mid-November. I hadn't had a full night's sleep in what felt like weeks. I was a ghost in my own life, hollowed out by fear and exhaustion. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to know. I had to have proof, even if it was only for myself. I had to know if I was truly crazy or if there was something there with me in the dark. So I formed a plan, a simple, terrifying plan. I was going to pretend to be asleep. I knew its pattern. It was active only when I was quiet and awake. Sleep was a sanctuary, a state it seemed to respect, or was simply uninterested in. My theory was that as long as it thought I was asleep, it would reveal itself. That night I went through my usual bedtime routine, making every action deliberate and natural. I brushed my teeth, changed my clothes, set my alarm. I got into bed and turned off the light at my usual time, around 11 p.m. But instead of letting my mind race, instead of tensing up and listening, I forced myself to relax. I focused on my breathing, making it deep and slow, the way it is in the first stages of sleep. I let my muscles go slack, my arm resting heavily on the pillow beside me. I kept my eyes closed, not squeezed shut in fear, but gently closed, the lids fluttering slightly as if in a dream. It was the hardest acting job of my life. Every instinct screamed at me to open my eyes, to sit up, to turn on the light. But I held my ground. I lay there, a statue of slumber, while inside, my mind was a screaming vortex of terror. For the first hour, nothing happened. There was only the oppressive silence of the house and the frantic, silent beating of my own heart. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I focused on my fake breathing. In, out, slow, even. I started to wonder if this was a mistake. Maybe there was nothing. Maybe I really was just losing my mind. And then I heard it. It was the faintest sound from downstairs. The single, soft creak of the third step on the staircase. My breath hitched in my chest, and I had to force it back into a slow rhythm. My entire body went rigid, a current of pure ice water shooting through my veins. It was on the stairs. I lay there feigning sleep as I heard another creak. The eighth step, slower this time, more deliberate, it was coming up. My mind was a slideshow of horrors. Who was it? What was it? What did it want? I fought the urge to bolt from the bed, to scream, to do something. But my plan, my desperate need to know, held me in place. I was a lure in a trap of my own making. I heard the softest of sounds from the top of the landing. The whisper of cloth, maybe. The brush of a foot on the old wooden floorboards. It was moving down the hallway, toward my room. Time seemed to stretch and distort. Every second was an eternity. My closed eyelids were a thin, useless shield. I could feel the presence as it drew nearer. The air in the room seemed to grow heavy, colder. It stopped right outside my door. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. It was absolute, profound, and full of an unimaginable intelligence and malice. It was waiting. It was listening. It was studying the silence just as I was. It was trying to determine if I was truly asleep. I focused every ounce of my willpower on my breathing. Inhale, exhale. I let a small, unconscious-sounding sigh escape my lips. I even forced a slight twitch in my leg like a dreaming dog. My body was screaming, drenched in a cold sweat under the blankets, but my performance had to be perfect. After a minute that felt like a lifetime, I heard the sound that broke me. A faint metallic click. It was the sound of my bedroom doorknob being turned. Slowly, incredibly slowly so as to not make a sound. It was the sound of practiced, silent entry. Then came the almost inaudible groan of the hinges as the door began to swing inward. It opened just a crack at first, then wider, wider until it was fully open. I didn't see it, of course. My eyes were closed, but I felt it. I felt the change in the air pressure in the room. I felt a subtle, cold draft wash over my face. Something was standing in my doorway. I could feel it. A weight, a presence, a focus of attention so intense it was a physical force. It was standing there in the dark, watching me sleep. This was it, the moment of truth. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I was sure it could be heard across the room. I could feel its gaze on me, scrutinizing, analyzing. The silence stretched on, taut and fragile. What would it do? Would it come closer? Would it touch me? Would it just stand there and watch me all night? The not knowing was a pure, refined form of torture. I had to open my eyes. I had to. But I was paralyzed by a fear so profound it was almost sublime. If I opened my eyes and saw nothing, I would know I was insane. If I opened my eyes and saw something, I didn't know which was worse. My fake sleep was beginning to crack. A tremor started in my hand. My breathing was becoming ragged. LD no. Any second now it would know I was awake. And then, as slowly and silently as it had opened, I heard the faint whisper of the door beginning to close. The cold draft receded. The presence in the doorway lessened. The door clicked shut, the sound of the latch settling into place, a deafening finality in the silence. And then a new sound, from the other side of the now closed door. The soft, deliberate creak of the floorboards in the hallway, moving away from my room, back toward the stairs. It had been in my room, it had stood over me, it had watched me, and it had left. It believed I was asleep. I lay there rigid until the sun came up. I didn't move a single muscle. The moment the first rays of light streamed through the window, I threw back the covers and ran. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't grab my wallet. I ran out of the house in my pajamas and my bare feet, got in my car and drove. I didn't look back. I never went back. I abandoned everything. The house, my job, my entire life in Massachusetts. I called my mother from a motel in Connecticut, babbling some incoherent story about a gas leak, about not feeling safe. I told my boss I was quitting for personal reasons. They thought I'd had a breakdown. Maybe I had. I left the house and everything in it to the bank. Let them deal with it. I wonder sometimes what they found. A house full of furniture, clothes in the closet, a half-finished book on the sofa. A life, flash-frozen and abandoned. That was 5 years ago. I live in Arizona now. I chose a place with no old houses, no deep forests, no oppressive silence. I live in a new, sterile apartment complex in a sprawling suburb of Phoenix where the sound of traffic never fully stops. It's the antithesis of Hemlock Lane. But it doesn't matter. The silence follows me. I can't sleep without the TV on. I can't bear a quiet room. I have 3 different white noise machines. But sometimes in the dead of night I'll wake up. The power might have gone out, or maybe my subconscious just won't let me rest. And in those moments of pure, unfiltered silence, I feel it. That old, familiar, watchful stillness. I have no answers. I never saw anything. I never heard a clear voice. It left no evidence of its existence, save for the wreckage it made of my mind. What was it? A uniquely intelligent haunting, a squatter of unbelievable stealth, or just a flaw in my own brain, a short circuit that plunged me into a nightmare of my own making? I don't know, and I don't think I want to. All I know is that something in my house knew when I was awake. It knew the difference between the stillness of a sleeping body and the stillness of a terrified, listening mind. And the only mercy it ever showed me was in its decision to let me believe, for one long, horrifying night, that I had successfully fooled it. Or maybe that was the cruelest part. Maybe it knew I was awake the whole time. Maybe it was just playing a game. And maybe all it ever wanted was for me to know that it knew.